Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Hari Om, everyone. Last week, we had summarized Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 until verse 44. Today, we will complete summarizing Chapter 2, verses 45 to 72. Members are requested to please read slowly and clearly so that others can follow along. It is okay if you are exceeding your time limit by a minute or two, but please wait till we call out your names after giving a few seconds pause in between each presenter, and then you can unmute and then begin the summary. So now we will begin with Kumar giving us the summary of Chapter 2, verses 45 to 47.
Hari Om. I'll talk about verses 45 to 47 of Chapter 2. In this chapter on Sankhya Yoga, Krishna implores Arjuna to shed all his misplaced thoughts and despondency and asks him to follow his Kshatriya dharma, to fight for what is right and what is good, and to defeat what is wrong and what is evil without being afraid of killing or being killed in this holy war. Krishna also asks Arjuna to become a karma yogi in his fight without any concerns about the outcome thereof. In the previous three verses 42 to 44, it stated that most people are desire-ridden and perform actions with focus only on the fruits of their actions, and as such have reduced dharma or religion to the mechanical practice of mere rites and rituals. They're driven by a selfish desire of acquiring material benefits instead of performing actions with the objective of attaining spiritual evolution. They fail to realize that the ultimate reality or truth lay far beyond these mundane materialistic rites and rituals. Such desire-ridden people see the rites and rituals as an end in itself, rather than a means to an end, the end being attainment of self-realization. The next three verses, 45 to 47, talk about the true karma yogi who performs his actions and duties for their own sake and is detached and free from the desire to enjoy the fruits of those actions or duties. Krishna tells Arjuna that one can attain union with self by becoming a karma yogi. His actions are performed with a sense of yajna or sacrifice. His only aim is to reduce his desires with a view to attaining spiritual evolution. He is indifferent to the success or failure of his actions. And it is for this reason that a karma yogi is able to maintain his equanimity of mind and be sthita prajna. Spiritual evolution or enlightenment can be attained by freeing oneself not only from the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, and from the dvandvas, pairs of opposites like heat and cold for the body, likes and dislikes for the mind, and honor and dishonor for the intellect, but also from all the desires. Krishna's advice to Arjuna applies to any seeker of evolution, and that is when one gets rid of the tamas and rajas and remains established in sattva, one will be able to attain the ultimate reality effortlessly. The jnani or the enlightened one, having attained God consciousness, is beyond everything, and even the Vedas are of no use to him. Having attained the ultimate state, the enlightened person enjoys eternal and absolute peace, happiness, and bliss. Verse 47 is one of the most quoted verses of the Gita, as it prescribes that one's right is only to the action, karma, and not to the results of or the fruits of one's actions, karma phalam. And further, that one should neither act with an eye on the reward, nor one should be attached to inaction. One must always continue to perform action and not be lazy, idle, or inactive. Just ensure that the action leads to some evolution in some way, in any way, shape, or form. For it is said that an idle mind is a devil's workshop. Action for the sake of action. It is well said that take up a job you love and you will never have to work a day in your life. Also, work is worship. As an analogy, to sum up these three verses, an obese person, a person loaded with innumerable desires, can reach his destination of self-realization faster only if he sheds the unwanted extra weight, which is of the needless desires that he has. To do this, he must focus on doing the right action, exercise, diet, and discipline without worrying about the results. The reward of his right action will surely follow. But his focus should not be in reaching the destination faster, but in sticking to the right action. Results will follow. As it is said, he is the richest who has fewest wants. Thank you, and over to Prema for the next 4 verses.
Thank you. Next, we can have Prema present chapter 2, verses 48 to 51.
Okay, can you hear? After introducing Karma Yoga in the 47th verse, Lord Krishna goes on to describe the actual meaning of Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga here means right action with right attitude. And he says that we have to give attention to the results and maintain equanimity in success and failure in our life. He tells us that if we shift our focus from the results and put more thought into the very action that we do, we will have a clear understanding of what we do, how we can do the action, why, when, where, and how much. So we have to focus on the action more than the result. All these details we must analyze and understand clearly about the action. If we do this, we will soon be able to derive joy from the action itself, and the focus on the results will become lesser. Even though the result is the main reason for what we do the action, our mind will soon shift focus from the result. This is because we are now able to enjoy the action that we do. But if we ultimately succeed in our action, of course we are joyous. But if we do not succeed in our action, we get satisfaction at least of giving our best to whatever that has to be done. So this is the key to to the equanimity of the mind. We have to apply this logic to all the real mundane tasks that we do every day in our life. Only then we will enjoy the tasks, so that the focus shifts naturally from the results to the action itself. Some actions in life are the ones that we choose to do. There's some that we like, but some actions in life are thrust upon us. They are ones that we dislike. But the Lord tells us here that even for the actions that we do not like, we have to find something that we like in them, so that they can be more enjoyable to us. This essentially means that we always have to have a plan B for all the activities we do in life. And preparing for the failure in life is actually the key to economy of the mind. Now, those who are motivated in the next verse, he goes on to say that those who are motivated in life only by success are extremely unfortunate. The success in life is not dependent only on our contribution towards action. There is always an unknown element that we call luck that we contribute towards our success. Of course, our contribution plays a very significant factor and but unless we have that element, which I would say is God's grace, nothing could be in our favor. We must always be aware of this fact, and those who focus only on the result of actions are indeed unfortunate, as they do not derive any happiness in life. Like a sports person who aims to win an Olympic gold medal, he would have practiced and trained so hard to succeed, but sometimes he loses a medal in the fraction of a second. This does not mean he's a failure. He will not feel like a failure only if he enjoys the sport he does. His focus on the training and the practice that take to the level of Olympics itself is should make him happy. So winning the gold medal or even a silver may not make a very big difference to him. Only when we understand that there is always an element of luck that makes all the difference between success and failure, we can shift our mind from the results to the action itself. The next verse, Lord introduces Buddhi Yoga, which is the attitude in which we perform the action. The proper attitude here means not being result-oriented. The focus on results would only lead to stress and anxiety. A person who's able to use his intellect and focus on the action at hand and proceed calmly without getting quickly and analyze his experiences with clarity and will always gravitate towards spiritual. In this way, he will be able to get rid of all his vasanas and will ultimately move towards the highest goal in life, which is liberation. After practicing Karma Yoga, he moves to Buddhi Yoga, and furthermore, he will move to the next higher stage, which is Jnana Yoga, and then that will lead him to moksha. As long as he goes through life's ups and downs without getting affected by them, he will enjoy his freedom in this world as long as he lives, and he will attain liberation when he passes away. He is freed from the repeated cycles of births and death, and he is also free from all the evils of the world. This is my summary for the 48th verse to the 50th. Thank you. I hope I've made myself clear. Anyone wants to ask any questions.
Okay, next we can have Pramod present verse 52 to 53 summary.
Hari Om. Today I'll summarize verses
Over you,
52 and
Pramod. I
53
have finished
of
with
chapter 2.
yeah.
These two verses cover the entire spiritual journey from the time that a spiritual seeker withdraws his
Are you
mind
able to hear
from its
what I said?
Sorry, one second. I'll start again. Today I will summarize verses 52 and 53 of chapter 2. These two verses cover the entire spiritual journey from the time that a spiritual seeker withdraws his mind from its preoccupation with the external world and begins to seek the divinity within, to becoming one with God or the self. Verse 52 covers the first part of that journey, preparing the mind to be indifferent to worldly pleasures without the feeling of disgust. The word used in this verse is nirvedam. Essentially, nirvedam is a measure of the purity of mind and dispassion or vairagya that is gained through spiritual sadhana. Lord Krishna tells us in this verse that only when our intellect crosses the mire of delusion or moha kalilam, that we can grow indifferent to what we experience in this mundane world through our five senses. Delusion is seen at two levels. Number one, at the level of our dharma, our duties, or the way we live our lives. And number two, at the level of our understanding of the true self. In the case of Arjuna, this dharma moha led to his refusal to do his duty and fight the righteous battle. To cross this mire of delusion, we must develop objectivity, or the ability to watch our experiences as an observer. The first milestone, the attainment of nirvedam or indifference, is a significant achievement, but it is not the the goal of spiritual life. It opens the way for the mind to be directed fully towards the divine or the self within. The next verse, 53, covers the second part of the spiritual journey, dissolving the mind and abiding in the self, which is the ultimate milestone for all spiritual seekers. To do this, one needs to be, first of all, aware of the bondage we live in, or the attachments and the likes and dislikes we live with due to the unsteady or asthira and the restless or chanchala nature of our mind. It's the knowledge of the self that gives potential for human beings to break through this bondage. Lord Krishna tells us that despite the perplexity we experience in life, we must learn to be immovable, or nischala, or equipoised. When the mind remains unshakable or balanced in all conditions, and the intellect remains steadfast, achala, in the self, one attains complete union or yogam. This is accomplished through the practice of the four yogas, karma, bhakti, jnana, and dhyana, which fixes our actions, cleanses it of selfishness, and helps us to sharply focus on one thought, the exclusion of all other thoughts, under the supervision of the intellect. This journey covered in the two verses, from nirvedam to yogam, or from indifference to abidance in the self, is generally referred to as a stormy period of antaranga sadhana, involving shravana, manana, and nididhyasana, or listening, contemplation, and meditation. Only after successfully overcoming all hurdles faced during this journey does one arrive at the stage of equipoise, or inner stabilization of the mind, which is followed by self-realization. So in summary, I took away 4 key milestones from these 2 verses that encapsulate the entire spiritual journey of a sadhaka. So the first one is nirvedam, or the indifference to worldly pleasures. The second is nischalam, the standing immovable or equipoised in the face of perplexities faced in life. Number 3 is achalam, remaining steadfast in the self. And number 4 is yogam, realizing the complete union with the self. Thank you, and Hari Om.
Next, we will pass it on to Sandhya to summarize the introduction to Sthita Prajna.
Good morning, everyone. Hari Om. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I will be introducing the concept of Sthita Prajna and with respect to Arjuna's state of debate and his journey to self-realization. Sthita Prajna is a Sanskrit and Vedic term. It's often translated into contented or calm or firm in judgment and wisdom. So the goal to achieve Sthita Prajna is to be firm in judgment and wisdom. The word Sthita Prajna arises from a combination of 2 words, Sthita, meaning existence or firmly resolved of being, and Prajna, meaning wisdom or intelligence. Hence, in the Bhagavad Gita, Sthita Prajna refers to a man of steady wisdom. In verse 55, Sthita Prajna is a term associated to one who renounces completely all the desires of the mind when he is fully satisfied with his mind fixed in Atma. So he makes a renunciation and he's satisfied in living in that higher self. Sthita Prajna is also often referred to as Jivan Mukta, which is one who is liberated while still living in an earthly life. And this is where the concept resonates well with us, as the ultimate goal of our Vedanta learning is to apply intellect to live a sattvic and liberated life, while still being able to interact in an earthly role that we have here. According to the Gita, a Sthita Prajna, so someone who has achieved Sthita Prajna, is free from worldly attachment or aversions. He does not need to seek the truth because he sees the truth. So the journey is over. He sees the truth always. He is free from motives and ego, has attained full knowledge of ultimate reality, does good deeds with no expectation of reward, and is aware of the oneness of reality. The Maya of the day-to-day world has fallen away. In chapter 2, as Arjuna's spiritual teacher, Krishna ji is tasked with how to rouse Arjuna from his despair, as we've heard already, and set him onto a way of self-realization. And it's through that self-realization that one attains Sthita Prajna. So Arjuna is in a state of debate, as we see, and the journey to self-realization is, as we discuss. Arjuna, as we've already known, is essentially known previous to the state of debate as a man of action, an intellect. He's intelligent. He's not often given to reflection, yet in his present crisis, he finds himself reflecting, and in that fight within himself, he's struggling between his earthly connections and his desires and his intellect or his true self. He's led to ask the perennial question, does he have a true divine inner being? Does it survive death? Is there a deeper reality that we perceive in the world around us? And how does this reality affect what choices we make, and vice versa in our everyday? So how does the reality affect our choices? Then how do our choices affect the reality? In his answer, Krishna touches on almost all the main themes and concepts of Gita. Chapter 2, as we've heard before, is really an overview of the 16 chapters to come. Most notably and importantly, Krishna reminds Arjuna that of his immortal nature, his real self, his Atma. He reminds him that his real self, his Atma, is eternal. It never dies, nor was it ever born. And thus the Gita hence gives us the moral at the forefront of the story in chapter 2. It states the immortal soul, or the self of the Atma, is more important than the passing world. Krishna assures Arjuna that his basic nature is not subject to time or death. It is immortal. To realize this truth, if he uses his intellect to see beyond the dualities of life, such as pain and pleasure, success and failure, and as mentioned earlier, even heat and cold, that he will see that the basic nature is immortal. The Gita does not teach us spirituality aimed at an enjoyable life hereafter, nor does it even teach a way to enhance power in this life or the next. It teaches us a basic detachment from pleasure and pain, and only in this way can an individual rise above the conditioning of life's dualities and identify with the Atma, and in other words, self-realization. As Arjuna's spiritual teacher, Krishna's task now is to enlighten Arjuna to move from this confusion and set him on the way to spiritual evolution and to self-realization. Arjuna questions Krishna about spiritual wisdom, experiential knowledge of the immortal self. He wants to know the difference that this kind of wisdom makes and how one conducts himself. He's focused on practical application and less on philosophical gyan. And that is, I feel, also what our Vedanta teachings are trying to help us bridge, the understanding between practical application and philosophical knowledge. Krishna answers, and I'm getting ahead of us, in verses 55 to 72. Those who are established in wisdom, sthita prajna, live in continuous unbroken awareness that they are not the perishable body, but the Atma. Further, they see the same self in everyone, for the Atma is universally present in all. As such, one does not identify with personal desires. Personal desires are the superficial layer of the personality, but one identifies with the self, the core. The self-realized is not motivated by personal desires or the entanglements of this earthly world, the samsara. Those established in self-realization control their senses instead of letting their senses control them. If the senses are not controlled, Krishna warns, the mind or emotions will follow wherever they lead, such as in the case of Arjuna, to the state of debate. Eventually, a person following their senses loses strength and a sense of purpose. When we keep thinking about sense objects, attachment comes. Attachment breeds desire, and then the lust of possession that burns into an anger of fear of missing out, or as the young people call it, FOMO. These emotions cloud our perception, and they keep us from learning. These themes are echoed repeatedly. Oh, sorry, that paragraph I'll talk about later in a discussion. That is my summary overall of Sthita Prajna and Krishna's consult to Arjuna as he goes through his state of debate and his journey to self-realization. Thank you. Hari Om.
Next, we can have Vijay present summary of 54 to 57.
Hari Om, everyone. I hope you can listen clearly. I'll be covering verse 54. Is the last portion for chapter 2 starts here. So Arjuna has recovered from his emotional downfall, and first time he's asking the questions to Lord Krishna. In the next 18 verses, Lord has given the brilliant expositions of ultimate state of a human perfection and the self-realized soul, reveling in the bliss of self and free from egocentric desires and attachments. It's like river feels totality when merges with the eternity ocean. Same way, the one who has achieved Sthita Prajna state is ready at the end of his life, Ananta Kale, for a Brahma Nirvana. Arjuna has asked 4 questions in the verse 54, in regards to the nature and the characteristics of the God-realized person. The first is, what is the nature of the self-realized soul? He uses 3 words, Sthita Prajna, the person of steady wisdom, Samadhistasya, one who is his mind is absolute, tranquil in reality, and Sthitardri, person who is intellect is firm and established in reality. Second question, he's asking how he speaks. Now, we will learn with Rangaji and Swamiji's commentary that the speech is an organ of action, representing all one of the organs of action, how one is performing as he's the finite, but already merged in the expressions of infinite. How does he sit? Representing in his inner personality, moving about in external world, he remains in contact with his real self, inner feelings and thoughts. How does he walk? Refers to one, that's a fourth question. How does he walk? Refers to one's behavior with the inside world and the contact with the things and the beings in the external environments. Lord Krishna answers him in verse 55. For me, verse 55 is an amazing explanation given by Lord Krishna. First of all, Lord answers the description of enlightened soul with the two distinct achievements. First, he says that one has read the mind of all desires. This is I read it 3-4 times. Swamiji has written in commentary, not one has got rid of desires of mind. One has read the mind of all desires. That is how he has written. Amazing explanation. Second, the state of total fulfillment. One reveals in self by self. Swami Parsarthi explains in his commentary that this verse does not say one has to renounce and abandon all their stations and activities and give up their duties and responsibilities in all roles of life. And first, he explains that the part 1 verse says, cast away all the desires of mind, has no meaning without the second part. Says that the one remains satisfied in self by self, makes possible on dropping desires. Swamiji further explains that the real technique for dropping the desires at any stage of life, this is what amazing explanations we can do it because we are now nowhere close to any of this stage. It's one has to move up and take up the next higher stage of desires. So in renunciation, sorry, my pronunciation, it's not giving up, it's taking up higher. Desires of child goes when he becomes youth, and the youth goes to the next stage of the life, and it goes on. Same like the flowers matures and the fruit comes and the petals are been renounced. So it's a stage by stage. If you try to pluck a petal earlier, the fruit will not come. Similarly, the growth of spiritual personality, it's a mark of your renunciations of one's desires. In Lord, continue in verse 56, answers the questions of Arjuna, how does Sthita Prajna or a self-realized person sits? State of perfection in the mind without the emotions and variance. Swamiji explains that verse does not idealizes the lack of emotions. Self-realized person's mind would also feel joy and suffering and sorrow. He will eat the sweet, he will feel the taste of sweet, but his intellect is governed and not let him get victimized by emotions. So one will have all the emotions, but he will not be emotional. He will have awareness to control the emotions, both joy and in sorrow. To have emotions is a virtue, but if that is overpowering intellect, judgment is a spiritual weakness. Its desires are, and further Swamiji explains that desire is the root cause of emotions. One develops the desires due to the sense in incompleteness, and to fill that unfulfillment void, thoughts and emotions goes in the world. If desires are deflected, creates anger. If desires are fulfilled, then one starts getting fear of losing what he or she has gained. So, verse saying Muni, sage of a steady wisdom, rooted in a true control of his desire and emotions, is free of anger and fear. In verse 57, Lord explains that one who is established in wisdom of truth is everywhere. Without attachment means, attachment, he or she meets the good or evil, and gets neither rejoice or hate. In verse 55, Lord has described the nature of enlightened soul. In verse 57, Lord has explained the state of inner personality. Now in verse 57, he is explaining how he walks, moves around in the world. As preceding two verses giving the impression that the Sthita-prajna person is inactive, insensitive to the world, rather than the perfect one is sarvatra, meaning everywhere in Shubha and Ashubha without an attachment. Attachment produces suffering and sorrow, but it's not the world that one contact is producing sorrow, but it's one's wrong relationship with it does. So the moment you drop your clinging attachment, wrong way towards the world, peace and bliss returns. Today, common person is so attached with world, and that's over rejoices when something pleasant comes and feels sorrow when the small displeasure comes. But the man of perfection doesn't fall in this mental fluctuations and remains steady in hot and cold, war and peace, birth and death. Yaha in this verse also represent whoever, includes any human being, irrespective of caste, religion, or wherever he is from. One who fits the above explanation will be called as an enlightened soul. My take again from this verse is for verse 55, when Swamiji has explained one has rid of mind of all desires. So you have lost your mind completely of any desire, which is impossible state, only Sthita-prajna can. Hari Om.
Thank you. Next, we can have Spati present summary of verses 58 to 61.
Hari Om, everyone. I'll be covering verse 58 to 61 of chapter 2. In verse 58, Lord Krishna answered the last of the 4 questions from Arjuna. How does a Sthita-prajna walk? To mean, how does he act and conduct himself in this world? And you've heard so much from Sandhya and about Sthita-prajna. As humans, we consistently seek peace and happiness, allowing our senses to run freely after objects and beings. Eventually, the mind craves for sense objects, create numerous desires, and overpower the intellect. This results in agitation and can lead to destruction. In the case of Sthita-prajna, one with steady wisdom, he understands that peace and happiness is not found in the objects and beings of the world, but in how he acts and conduct himself in relation to these objects and beings. A technique he employed is pratyahara, which is withdrawing the 5 sense organs discriminately using his alert and steady intellect. This will prevent any temptation and will only entertain thoughts that are aligned to the self in all. In such case, he becomes unaffected and fortify himself against any sensual temptations. Verse 59 and 60 elaborate on the nature of the senses, their importance for survival, and their devastating effect if they are not controlled. We cannot permanently withdraw the senses in all situations of life. We must engage the senses because they are necessary for survival. In order to know when to engage a sense perceptions and when to withdraw, we must have a developed intellect. Also, to remain focused in life. Whenever a person sense objects indiscriminately, the mind has a tendency to find more and more desires. But when the person strives with sincerity to abstain from the sense objects, the temptations are curbed and future desires diminishes. This supports the law of demand and supply. Where there is a demand, there will be supply. Where there is no demand, there will be no supply. So, as long as you abstain from sensual indulgences, the sense objects will gradually leave you, but the relish, the taste, the memory will linger in your mind. Verse 60 specifically explained the devastating effect of the sense organs if not controlled. The lingering relish can ignite the indulgence in the sense objects and cause the push effect of the senses. As we have 5 senses to deal with, plus the pull effect of the objects can cause the mind of even a learned individual who is striving for spiritual evolution to become unstable and sway towards the world with a force that toppled the intellect. In verse 61, the Lord said, having controlled them all, meaning control the senses and the mind, one is ready for meditation. We certainly know this cannot happen without a strong and alert intellect. The senses and the ungoverned mind cause one to go through turmoil, not slip to an object, becomes attached. Desires are formed, and when the desires cannot be achieved, anger arose and lead to loss of intellect, which we all hear of, which we will all hear of in the next verse. The one who is able to develop the intellect to control the mind and senses is ready for meditation. So the lesson is we must develop the intellect strong enough to govern the mind and senses so that we can be ready for meditation on the self. Thank you and Hari Om.
Next, we can have Chitra present summary of verse 62 and 63.
Hari Om. As Sati has just mentioned, we saw in verse 60 that the turbulent senses of even a wise person can forcibly carry away his mind. Krishna expands on this further in verses 62 and 63. He explains how the lack of spiritual fulfillment causes us to fall. Ignorance of the self results in a void within us, despite what life has to offer. To overcome this void, we turn our thoughts towards objects in the world. The thin stream of thoughts we have towards an object is attachment, which, if left unchecked by the intellect, becomes a thick of thoughts and changes to desire. This is comparable to the origin of the mighty river Ganga. It starts as an insignificant trickle of water, but as it flows down the mountain, more and more flows join until it becomes a torrential flow. It is easier to control the senses at the earlier stages of thoughts. Once our mind gathers desires, it moves us rapidly towards acquisition and indulgence. If this flow is interrupted, it results in anger. The greater the desire, the greater the anger, when anything gets in the way. Anger here represents all the negative emotions that make us lose our mind. Example, lust, fear, envy, greed, stress, anxiety, and depression. These negative emotions lead to a state of delusion where we lose control of our mind. Delusion leads to a loss of memory. We forget our roles, our responsibilities, our purpose in life. And that leads to the loss of our intellect. Without the intellect, we resort to self-destructive actions like losing our temper or saying things we regret, which further plunges us into depression. This is the ladder of fall. We question why things are happening to us and blame the world for our plight, not realizing that our ungoverned mind has led us down this path of destruction. Thank you.
Thank you. We can have Bhaskar present summary of verses 64 to 68, please.
Thank you, and thanks, Chitraji. Hari Om, everyone, and my humble salutations to our gurus. As Krishna explained in prior verses, the ladder of fall, in other words, the downward sequence of object enjoyment, attachment, desire leading to anger, as Chitraji explained, then anger leading to delusion, then that leading to loss of knowledge and destruction. This downward spiral is what Krishna warns Arjuna about and essentially establishes that the Sthita Prajna is someone who has overcome this. And so in the verses that follow 64 to 68, which I'm going to summarize, Krishna continues to answer Arjuna's question as to how the Sthita Prajna, or a person of steady wisdom, speaks and behaves in the world. In verse 64, Lord Krishna provides us a technique to avoid self-control, to achieve self-control. So this is very important, and this is the most important takeaway for me from these sets of verses. 65 to 68, he goes on to describe how tranquility or equanimity of the mind that results from such self-control leads to happiness and knowledge, and also consequence of what will be at risk if we don't exercise self-control, and suggests how it leads to spiritual development by overcoming and exercising self-control. So let's double click on these verses with some examples to make the point. In verse 64, Krishna's main message is that though the use of our sense organs, what are the sense organs? The 5 sense organs: eyes, tongue, nose, ears, and touch. They call it Rupa, Rasa, Gandha, Sabda, Sparsa. Using them in day-to-day life is unavoidable. We have to use them. But what's important is we have to regulate the use of these senses world we live in by developing our ability to regulate the senses using our intellect and not getting addicted to them, right? And the technique that Krishna prescribes here is if you manage your likes and dislikes, because if you think about it deeply, likes and dislikes are the ones that force you to exercise your sense organs. If you like something, you eat more of it or drink more of it, things of that nature. So we need to think about, so Krishna sort of precipitates the 5 sense organs and the impact on just these 2 words, likes and dislikes, raga, dvesha. And so we should control our sense organs rather than the sense organs controlling us. And it is like driving a car. I think Rangaji has given this example, driving a car properly to reach our destination, using our intellect to control the mind. The mind is the steering in this particular analogy, and the wheels are the actual senses, and the car is our body. And so this is also described in a Upanishad called the Kathopanishad, where they talk obviously about a chariot and the horses that drive the chariot and the reins and so on. But the point is, Krishna declares that only one who has this kind of control of sense can achieve tranquility or equanimity of the mind. So which is kind of the characteristic of a Sthita Prajna that he's continuing to describe. In verse 65, Krishna explains that such a tranquil mind, what does it give you? We are always interested in what's the outcome. Okay, I'm controlling the senses. I have managed my likes and dislikes. What do I get for it? You get 2 things. One, destruction of sorrows. And of course, we'll explain what the word sorrow means here. conversely bringing in more happiness and joy. And secondly, it helps this Stita Prajna to remain rooted and established in knowledge. So he's kind of explaining the logic between how a tranquil mind can lead to those things. And the tranquil mind is achieved as a result of self-control. So he's kind of step by step logically explained to Arjuna how the Stita Prajna gets to where that person is. Now, in this context, the word sorrow has to be interpreted as the samsara, or the entanglement in the worldly life of birth and death cycle. That's what Krishna refers to as sorrow, or what you can overcome when you get self-control. So the other important point in this verse is that happiness does not have to come from outside. So it is not by the sense objects that you get a happiness. The happiness is an internal state, as all of us know. So you don't need to go in search of happiness outside, and therefore thinking that indulging in the senses is the way to get happiness is the mistake. And the Stita Prajna is someone who has transcended beyond that and understood that happiness comes from within, and therefore that motivation prevents or helps that person not to go after sense objects and exercise the senses. So that's kind of how Krishna explains to us how we can actually take away. It's like a dog biting a bone, and obviously it gets hurt and some blood comes, and the dog thinks that the blood is actually from the bone, which is not the case. So we think that the happiness is from external sense objects, but that's not the case. It's from within. So, and a steady wisdom that results from such sense regulation is referred to, as the important characteristic of Stita Prajna. In verse 66, Krishna is highlighting two important characteristics. One is sama and dhamma, or disciplines. Sama and dhamma. Sama is sensory control, and dhamma is mind control, which we have been already talking about. These are important at every stage of spiritual sadhana. That's what he says. It's not something that you just practice one day and next day you will become a Stita Prajna. It is required to continuously sustain these disciplines. And whether you're listening to scriptures, which is Shravanam, or you're internalizing the scriptures in terms of doubt clarification and conviction, which is Mananam, or you're in meditation contemplation, which is Nididhyasanam. Throughout these three stages of the Jnana Yoga pursuit, you need to really have control of senses, is what Krishna's point is. And then the main point is the sustaining of the discipline. When a person does not practice this discipline in a sustained manner, there's no way one can make spiritual progress and achieve self-realization. Atmananda can only blossom in a calm mind, and we can look at reflection only in very still water. And when you want to see reflection in a mirror, for example, the mirror is constantly shaking, you cannot see it. The mirror has to be steady. So Krishna actually impresses upon the point that the Stita Prajna is someone who has the knowledge steady in that person. So the word steady is very important, and I take it more as sort of something that's you need to sustain, so that the knowledge is well rooted and well established, that it cannot be shaken by over time. So in verse 67 and 68, Krishna emphasizes on self-control. So I think he talks about a wayward sense organ will not allow the knowledge to take place. I think Rangaji gave example in a couple of classes ago where somebody came by their class and Swamiji was teaching them, and everyone in the class was looking at somebody who was going by the door or has come to the door or going by the window. So our mind is so wavering that it's important for us to really control the mind by not allowing it to wander. And Krishna warns Arjuna that a Stita Prajna is someone who has actually overcome that wavering mind. And that's important to really get that sustained sense of the knowledge getting rooted in the individual. In verse 68, I think there is also there's an example that Krishna gives in verse 67, which is the boat example. The boat is knowledge, and you use the boat of knowledge to cross the river of samsara, and the oars are the intellect, and you have to use the oars of the intellect to really take the boat safely from this side to that side of samsara, using the boat being the knowledge in this particular case. So the well-rooted knowledge helps you to cross samsara and reach your self-realization. Verse 68, which is the last one that I've taken on, the Krishna suggests that the seeker's sense organs must be restrained. But it's important to note that Krishna never suggested that the suppression of sense organs, he never suggested that the sense organs should be suppressed. This is something that I took away as an important lesson here. So he's only asking us to intelligently regulate and have sense organs to have 100% controlling you. Sense organs is like a powerful river, right? We all know that stopping the river is not good because it can lead to flood, because it's very powerful and it can really break open, and cause a lot of flood in the areas around it. But letting it go to the sea is also a waste of the river's power. So what we really need is intelligent regulation of the river to really irrigate the fields or to develop hydroelectric power, etc. It is by this way that the Sthita Prajna, or a person of steady wisdom, has achieved, according to Krishna, through sense regulation and management of his or her likes and dislikes. So that's kind of my main takeaway, is to kind of focus on your likes and dislikes and understand the impact of the sense organs on the likes and dislikes, and see how one can manage it. And one can develop the discipline of sama and dhamma, so we can be steady and sustained in this, to really get knowledge rooted in us, or at least make an attempt towards that. So before I hand over to Meryl for verses 69 to 62, I'm happy to clarify any questions you may have on on my summary and what I said in the last few minutes. Thank you. Hari Om.
Thank you. Now, to conclude chapter 2, we'll have Meryl present her summary of verses 69 to 72.
Hari Om, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. I'm going to probably break with the rule a little bit. I'm going to provide a little bit of my understanding in the beginning, and then the summary of the verses toward the end. As I listen and reflect upon the previous verses and chapters, I can't help but feel like I'm part of a great love story, the love story of all love stories, which can be likened to a mother's unconditional love for her child. I feel like Arjuna on that battlefield, fighting this epic battle between perceptions and actions, likes and dislikes, feelings and emotions, and thoughts and ideas, and experiencing the constant suffering and mental agitation this involvement and entanglement in the worldly things, beings, pursuits, and my obsession and attachment to them are causing. I feel the desperation and confusion, the urge to flee or freeze and become numb to the great and overwhelming pressure and weight of this most significant decision to do something or act in a way that I know all too well. Every ounce of my being is frozen and paralyzed by the fear of my perceptions, my feelings, my emotions, my thoughts and ideas of the reality that lie before me, rendering me helpless. Yet, I'm embraced with the presence and example of greatness, of devotion, of calmness, of confidence and self-assuredness at this most telling hour of my life. I am being presented with the prescription of all prescriptions of how to face my greatest fear, of how to become a perfect human. It is being laid out before me, frame by frame. It teases, tantalizes, inspires, compares, and contrasts many times over to hammer home this ultimate knowledge, providing the ultimate answer, all of which culminates in the final 4 verses of chapter 2, which further explains and summarizes what it is to be a self-realized soul. Verse 59 teases as it uses cryptic language in an attempt to keep the mind on its toes and interested. It explains the great chasm between an ignorant human in the world and an enlightened being, using the sleep and waking states of an average person. It shows that the sight of an enlightened one is illuminated in the darkness of the sleep states of an average man and is blinded to the illusion and delusions of their waking state, thus indicating that an enlightened being sees all things as they are, and therefore do not know the bondage and caging of worldly involvement. Their state is of a constant and sublime peace, which is ever changeless and imperishable, compared to an average person who is caught up in an ever-changing web of personalities and who chases an ever-changing and perishable world. In verse 70, Lord Krishna moves to a grander and more expanded portrayal of self-realized being from nature and uses the ocean as a comparison for a sage. Like rivers in their multitude, shapes, size, and forms flow to the ocean, their effect on it remains uneventful, as the ocean is not affected nor displaced by them. Rather, it receives the flow without any dissension or prejudice and allows the merging to be seamless. Similarly, an enlightened being contacts the world of beings and objects from a surrendered state of being, at peace and rest. Without any seeking, they allow life to flow towards them, fully greeting it at every juncture, without being perturbed or disturbed by it. In contrast, the enlightened sage who abides in the ocean of himself, wanting for nothing that this world has to offer, an average person contacts the world from a place of constant greed, always seeking, constantly searching, in constant exhaustion. Verse 71 answers Arjuna's 4 questions once more and describes that a self-realized person moves about in the world free from all desires that are not driven by their desires to move from one experience to the other, and so on. They are under the watchful guidance of the subtle intellect and are therefore unaffected by sense objects, feelings, emotions, and thoughts. Their nature is devoid of wanting or cravings of this world. They understand that this is not theirs and neither seek to claim it or reject it. Therefore, they seek not and want not. An enlightened one remains true to their nature, which is peace and bliss, and has no worry about in the world looking for things to make them happy. They are already happy and feel at home in themselves. Just like an actor takes on a role and throws their entire self in that role, but never once loses themselves in that role, so too is the experience of a self-realized being. They play the roles given, but never forgetting who they are in the process. In conclusion, verse 72 demonstrates the final stage of an enlightened sage, also known as Brahman, Atman, or God, a state referred to as pure unconditioned consciousness, also called Turiya, or fourth. This fourth state is referred to as the transcendental state, which is said to be beyond the waking, dream, and deep sleep states of consciousness. Having conquered the trials and tribulations of the great internal battle of the conditioned states of being, the waker, the dreamer, and a deep sleeper, where confusion reigned supreme, and where who and what you are was an illusory concept, and where you came from and where you are heading had no signpost, you regain supreme wisdom. All illusions and delusions fall away, and your conditioned way of being ceases to exist. All that remains now is an unconditional state of consciousness, a seamless merging with your supreme being. You have arrived at this place of everlasting, changeless, imperishable bliss. You've come home. Thank you. Hari Om.
Thank you all for the summaries. Now, if Rangaji has anything to add, or we can go ahead.
Yeah, we can take up the questions.
The first set of questions is from Divya. Reference is chapter 2, verse 45. Please elaborate on the term yoga shame, referenced as malady from obsession for acquisition and preservation. In this context, how is yoga different from union, oneness with the self?
Divya chapter 2 verse 45 talks about yoga as union with the self. That's the only reference. Steadfast in yoga, perform your action. Samatvam yoga uchyate. The equanimity of mind that you gain through karma yoga is what he calls as yoga here. So verse 45, you're referring to 45. Okay, please elaborate on the term yoga kshema as malady from obsession for acquisition and preservation. So in this verse, there are two interpretations for the word yoga. From a mundane point of view, attaining union with the object of your desire is yoga. Protecting the object of your desire or your happiness is shema. From the ultimate point of view, yoga is union with the self, self-realization. Shema is the permanent peace and happiness that follows it. This is further in detail elaborated or very directly spoken in chapter 9, verse 22. Wherever we find this word yoga, the only interpretation or the only reference is uniting with the higher, uniting with the self. Next.
Reference chapter 2, verse 55. Please revise the concept where remaining satisfied. One revels in the self by the self.
Revise the concept where remaining satisfied, one revels in the self by the self. Reveling can happen because of a desire fulfilled at the level of body. Reveling or enjoyment can happen because of a desire fulfilled at the level of emotions, mind. You seek a company and get it. For a while you are happy. You seek a material object and get it. You are happy for a while. You seek a knowledge, inquisitiveness, you get it. You are happy for a while. When all desires are overcome through knowledge, as you gain knowledge, what happens is you understand the futility of how the mind is caught up with things. This is called exhaustion of desire. The knowledge of higher brings a contrast. Just as a child that knows a bicycle understands the futility of toys. It doesn't hate toys. It has seen something subtler. In that way, knowledge all the time, as you gain knowledge, it keeps contrasting with the desires. It exposes the limitation, absurdity of desires. Having gained complete knowledge, one revels in the self by the self. Means the void that is at the root of mind in everyone has disappeared. There's a void feeling. This void feeling happens because of identification with body, mind, and intellect. That has disappeared in a Jivan Mukta or a self-realized person. So that person is satisfied in the self by the self. He doesn't require any external object to keep the mind happy. There are two ways to keep the mind at bay. One is to give the bone that it wants. For a while it is okay. The other is by knowledge elevating the mind. Permanently it is out of misery. This is the only way. Next.
On taking up higher values, as a person with family obligations and self-centered interests such as food, clothing, comforts of home, etc., What would higher values practically represent?
Higher value for any one of us means gaining the knowledge. The first higher value is to gain the knowledge of what life purpose is. All of us are groping in darkness, because of which we are entangled in all this. So what is the higher value for a person who's in a family who has certain obligations? To expand the circle of identification to others. That is the only thing you can do. That is higher, which is very high enough. Expand the circle of identification. So materially, when you expand the circle of identification, you go from taking, aggrandizing, to giving and sharing. We are in Chennai now. We have 4 dogs at home. There was a loaf of bread not used for 2 days. So I went outside and fed a street dog. The 4 dogs in the house pounced out from the first floor. And 2 literally, they were on me. So if they had a mouth to ask, they would ask, how dare you feed a street dog? Right? This is what the mind in all of us is. The house dog is never going to say, I'm getting 4 eggs a day. I'm getting a loaf of bread a day. I'm sleeping in an air-conditioned room. The psoriasis street dog, why not get just a slice of bread? Can the dog think? If we don't think beyond my son, my daughter, my husband, my wife, my father, my mother, you and me are nothing more than a cattle in human body. Right? This is what the Vedas are trying to tell us. At least when we have the basics that are taken care of in life, why can't the person think of others? No point of time we think of others. The biological heart can beat only for you, but the philosophical heart can pulsate for everyone. It doesn't have to be your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, your father, your mother. It can beat for others. It can beat for a squirrel. It can beat for a bird. This is what a person has to do, whether you are in the family or you're all by yourself. Doesn't matter. There are at least a dozen of people who are single. They are not married, or they are single for whatever reason. So does that mean spirituality or realization is easier for them? Ask them. Not really. In terms of certain practical choices of life, it could be easier. That's all. So the focal point is how attached the mind is. Whoever personally asks, first time in the class I'm saying this, whoever personally asks, Vijay Divya's son asked me when he got the first month's salary, he brought $50. It was 4 or 5 years back. He said, I'm paid. I want to give something. If I give more, I know you won't take. So I'm giving you this $50, and he prostrated. I said, did you give this to your grandma? Because of her, you have a family today. He said, yes, I did. And my parents asked me to ask you, what is that I should do? First month's salary, should I give it to temple? He said, no. You have a party with your friends. And then if there are in your friend circle who have not got a job, help them with some money to get a job. Suppose they are filing applications, they're applying for higher studies. If you have that little bit of extra money, you can help your own friends, your school friends, your university friends. From a long-term perspective, you are born in an Orthodox family. The Vedas say that you should endorse the education of one person to study Vedas. One Vedic Brahmin's education you should endorse in your life. One poor girl's marriage you should support in your life. If you don't do these two, you wasted your Brahminhood. I'm not saying this. All of us have wasted our Brahminhood. All your money is going for Harvard Business School, Stanford, Oxford. That has got nothing to do with whether you are in family or outside the family. How much is required to support a Brahmin boy studying in a Vedic Patashala? 200 rupees? 300 rupees? It's not even a slice of pizza. So what is that you can do? We can think along these lines of, am I identifying with others? When we are in a family, all the identification converges to attachment. Being aware of that attachment is liberation. You're aware that you're attached and how limited you have become as a person. If we are aware of it, we are on the way to liberation. Materially, from aggrandizing to sharing. Emotionally, from attachment to identification. Intellectually, from endless chasing of information relating to the world to Atma Jnanam. These three have to be done. Whether you are in a family or all by yourself, it doesn't make any difference. These are the three broad categories of sadhana. And in terms of company, satsang. Satsang means company of people who elevate your spirituality. Next.
Next set of questions are from Merrill. For this one, reference is chapter 2, verses 70 to 72. If I'm understanding verse 70 correctly, our purpose as humans is not to chase, seek, become dazzled by the external world, but allow the external world to flow towards us and allow the merging of that experience to take place. But just as the river merges and becomes one with the ocean, and the external world merges with the self, what happens then? From this state of ultimate peace, what happens with the individual? Does it mean that the individual becomes the master of their experiences, seeing the choices that exist in all experiences, and is able to move through them all with objectivity and divine sight?
Do you still have this question, Merrill, after you prepared the summary? Huh? I don't know how many concentrated on people's summary. I tried to. So I would presume that you had this question before you prepared the summary. Because the person who asked this question cannot be the person who prepared that summary. So read your own summary. You must have got the answer for this question. The individual consciousness merges with the total. Nothing happens to the world. World is an activity of the mind. As long as the mind's activity lasts, the pluralistic projection lasts. The split between the individual consciousness, when the individual consciousness is created, world is projected. When the individual consciousness is blanketed, the world goes into a dormant form, sleep. When the individual consciousness merges with the pure consciousness, it attains the state of universality. There's no pluralistic projection, which you beautifully summarized. So the whole thing, the key is in the mind and the consciousness. Waking, dream, deep sleep states are because of the mind. When the activity of mind is overcome, pure consciousness is apprehended. That's the state of realization. The pluralistic projection disappears. That we cannot understand intellectually from this state. That is why we give the example of deep sleep and dream. Deep sleep is a state where there is no individual, no world. Dream is a state where there is a dreamer, individual, and the dream world. Waking is a state where there is a waker, Merrill, experiencing a waking world, aware of dream and deep sleep. Pure consciousness, Turiya, is the state where the mind is overcome. The individual consciousness, which is the mind itself, has merged with the total consciousness. Individual consciousness means the mind, that's all. Mind has merged with the total. There's no world after that. There's one amalgamation of infinite reality. That's why I said the one who asked this question cannot be the one who prepared that summary. Next. Unless you are testing me, Mirror, my concentration.
No, that question was asked about a month ago. And so it's just showing up now. Thank you.
Next question, reference is chapter 2, verses 71-72. Atman Ayan Tristan. Please explain.
What is it, Meryl? I didn't understand.
This is not my question.
Okay, so let's go to the next.
Now we'll go to general Q&A. This question is from Yukant. From the poem, The Pond, the chicken makes the mistake of not listening to its mother. As children, we also tend to make decisions which are not in our best interest. How to make right decisions and how to know they are right, since our knowledge of the world is limited?
Yukant is probably 8th standard or 9th standard boy who attended the Satsanga classes. And he has been waiting to ask this question for many months. Finally, he sent it. So he was thinking there will be an interaction. Due to time difference, he could not join the session. So finally, I said, send it here. You can at least watch the video. So Yukant, how to make right decisions, how to know they are right, since our knowledge of world is limited. How to make right decisions. It is right decision means a product of intellect. In areas of knowledge and expertise, your intellect directs you to the right decision. But the challenge is your mind may have certain other likes or dislike that decision. The problem is not identifying what is right from what is wrong. All of us know that. Every human being knows what is right from what is wrong. Your own inner voice tells you. But the challenge is there is a more powerful force in each and every one of us called as the mind, which seeks instantaneous pleasures. So how to combat the pressures of the mind and go along the path that is shown by the intellect? This is the challenge, which is what is depicted in the poem Pond. I am really remarkably fond of water, says the chicken. Because the mother says, don't go and play inside the water along with the ducks. They know how to swim. You don't know how to swim. So the chick says, I am really remarkably fond of water. I am really remarkably fond of pizza. I am really remarkably fond of hiking. I am really remarkably fond of a drink. Each one's problem, you just put it there. Really remarkably fond of dash. Whatever is your problem, whatever is my problem. So I know what is right, what is wrong for me. That's not the problem. No guru is required to tell me what is right, what is wrong. But the problem is when the mind comes and forces the person to take leap along the plane of desires, we become weak. So any amount of knowledge of the world will not help. There are psychiatrists who are committing suicide, mental health experts who are taking a pill or a drink to sleep. There are priests who are going to prison because they have accumulated ill-gotten wealth, molested young children. Knowledge of world, in what way they are less? They know everything. The problem is the mind in them forces them to do certain things which they themselves know is wrong. So by developing the intellect, knowing the difference between mind and intellect, and intelligence has to be gained in order to take you along that path. Intelligence per se is of no use. It is like a mule carrying diamond and gold. For the mule, it makes no difference whether it is 100 kilos of gold or 100 kilos of garbage. It is weight. So what is the way out? The way out is to start studying Vedanta as it is relevant to your age, your understanding, and develop that inner insight. Next.
Next question also is from Yukant. How to increase sattva?
Increasing sattva happens when you gain knowledge to reduce rajas and tamas. How do you remove darkness from a room? Very powerful vacuum cleaner you bring and then suck out darkness from a room. Can you do that? You cannot do that. How to remove darkness from a room? The moment you strike a matchstick, the room becomes lit. If you light a candle, the room becomes lit. If you switch on a flashlight, the room becomes lit. If you switch on the lights, the room becomes lit. If you open the doors and the windows, the room becomes lit. But the light in all these examples are different. When you strike a matchstick, minimum light. When you open the windows, maximum sunlight. Similarly, striking a matchstick to opening the window is the varying levels of knowledge a person can gain. As much knowledge as you bring, rajas and tamas disappears. You become more sattvic. So you cannot gain sattva. In other words, gaining sattva is like gaining physical hygiene. How do you gain physical hygiene? You cannot buy it from a shop and put it into your hands. By removing the dirt in your hands become clean. So how to clean my hands, if you ask? Remove the dirt. As you remove the dirt, the hand becomes clean. How to gain sattva for the mind? By reducing rajas and tamas. How to reduce rajas and tamas? Knowledge of Vedanta helps you to place a check upon your mind. It is the mind that is picking up rajas and tamas. So as you develop a check on rajas and tamas, you will find sattva automatically increases. You don't have to bother about it. Am I becoming sattvic? Am I becoming sattvic? You don't have to be excited about it. It happens. Next.
Not convinced with formless worship. Can you explain better?
Do form worship. You don't have to do anything that you are not convinced you can't. The question is not formless worship or form worship. The question is your understanding of what your intellect shows you as the reality. Worship is not the question of worship. It is the question of the extent of faith and the direction in which the faith indicates you. Suppose you are a person whose faith is of this nature of automatically, easily associating with the form. Through the form, you associate with the formless reality. The reality is formless. You are seeing a Rama in front, you are seeing a Krishna in front and getting spiritually elevated. What about a blind person? Does that mean God doesn't exist for the person? He cannot get spiritual elevation. So, beyond the five senses, mind and intellect remains the reality. But for us to know anything in the world, we need the five senses or the mind or the intellect. There's a catch-22 position. The reality is beyond five senses, mind and intellect. But for you to know anything, you have to know through the five senses or mind or intellect. So if something cannot be known through five senses, mind or intellect, it doesn't exist for you. So the intangible reality has to be brought into a tangible denomination, which is what the form is. A form of Ganesha represents self-realization. The form of Shiva in a linga represents the transcendental reality being the substratum of terrestrial world. Transcendental is the substratum, not seen. Terrestrial world is the linga that is seen. So every form is talking about the formless in a coded, seeded language. So if you are that person who is very comfortable with a form-based worship, go through it. But somewhere down the line, understand all these forms indicate that formless reality. Next. Okay. So thank you very much. We'll meet next week, inshallah, with the introduction to the third chapter. Hari Om.